to tonight's town hall. This is our second town hall of 2021. I'm Rachel Rollins, the district attorney, and I want to tell you that when I became district attorney, I promised to hold quarterly town halls where we would go out into the community. We'd actually leave one Bullfinch and go out and meet with residents to not only hear directly from me about the amazing work the office is doing, but also have an opportunity to answer questions that people might have about the work that we're doing. Prior to the pandemic, these town halls took place in our vibrant towns and neighborhoods that make up Suffolk County. So in 2019, we went to Roxbury in March, we went to Chelsea in June, Winthrop in September, and Mattapan in December of 2019. The pandemic then prompted us to move to a virtual setting, which allowed us to delve a little bit deeper into topical issues as opposed to geographical locations, which is where we were, our original focus was. At the last virtual town hall, we considered crimes and discussed crimes that disproportionately impacted women. Tonight, we will have a candid conversation on a matter that has become, unfortunately, increasingly into public view in the last 4 years, and especially since the start of the pandemic, hate crimes. In particular, tonight's conversation will recognize the AAPI, which is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and examine how we can combat the nationwide spike in anti-Asian hatred. Before we talk about Suffolk County public safety issues in depth, it's important that we acknowledge the recent events that have reminded us all that change is possible and that it can be difficult at times to sustain. In April, we witnessed the groundbreaking moment of accountability in the form of Derek Chauvin's conviction, but in the same month, unfortunately, Duante Wright was killed during a traffic stop. Lieutenant Nazario was pepper sprayed while in uniform, serving our country, and several families buried their children far too early. These events, which can inspire both hope and grief and trauma, must continue us to push forward. The verdict in the George Floyd homicide trial was not vindication. It was a moment of accountability that can't redeem, unfortunately, a long history of injustice. A guilty verdict doesn't erase the trauma and pain felt by victims and survivors. It does not bring back George Floyd into the arms of his family members. It does not confer tranquility upon a people whose very humanity again and again, unfortunately, becomes the subject of debate and deliberation. It's a moment to build upon, and the fight for justice continues. My office is committed to playing our role in this fight. In the last few months, we've done a few of these things. We've selected, let me grab a water, sorry. Oh my goodness, apologies, guys. In the last few months, we selected our first class of Paul McLaughlin scholars, high school juniors who will have a paid internship with my office, along with a college scholarship to help them on their path to becoming future leaders. Our scholars proudly represent Suffolk County communities that have historically been underrepresented, the very communities that Assistant Attorney General Paul McLaughlin dedicated his life to serving. Additionally, we received a grant of $16,000 from MOVA, the Massachusetts Office of Victim Assistance, that will allow a cohort of 10 Suffolk County District Attorney's Office staff members to train with the National SEED project. SEED stands for Seeking Educational Equity and Diversity. This 8-part training facilitates participants' exploration of their own identities and biases, provides historical education on racism, and trains participants to facilitate vital conversations on race, equity, and other challenging topics necessary to support the reconciliation and healing in some of our communities. Our office also began a process of remedying the harm caused by the catastrophic failure of management, excuse me, at the now closed Hinton State Laboratory Institute. Our Hinton Lab initiative has brought together law enforcement partners, activists, and advocacy organizations, as well as academics and criminal defense attorneys to make systemic change. As you guys know, two disgraced chemists, Dukin and Farak, were both at one time in the Hinton Lab, and they have impacted negatively tens of thousands of individuals as a result of their criminal behavior. And finally, our office helped bring an end to a long and troubling chapter in Boston's history by assenting to a motion by Sean Ellis to vacate his one remaining conviction for a firearm. We assented to his motion for a new trial, and a judge immediately granted that motion, acknowledging it was a very sad chapter in the history of Boston. And sadly, Police Detective John James Mulligan, who unfortunately was involved in corruption with several other detectives in the Boston Police Department, lost his life that evening. However, the injustice that we saw and the corruption we saw that tainted this investigation from beginning to end required us to assent to that motion with Mr. Ellis. When we transition, and we're about to turn it over to Ursula Knight, who is going to give us a presentation on hate crimes. She is an exceptional assistant district attorney leading in our office. But as we transition, I want you to know our communities are going to begin the process of returning to hopefully what we are going to call normal. As we come out this weekend, Memorial Day weekend, the mayor has reopened the city of Boston. The pandemic has not only exacerbated the deeply rooted inequalities in some of our communities, but also exposed, unfortunately, bigotry that still plagues our society. My office just recently finished a case that started before the pandemic, in which a Lexington man was found guilty of 4 charges connected to a racist attack on a Black customer and a Black employee at a restaurant in the Seaport called the Empire. These type of attacks cause harm beyond the intended victims. They damage and destabilize communities where people already feel targeted. Americans today are becoming more and more aware of the hate-fueled terror many communities have known firsthand for generations. People are learning of the silenced horrors, for example, of the Tulsa massacre in 2021, while seeing a full century later eerily similar events in El Paso, Pittsburgh, Charlestown, and most recently and terrifyingly in Atlanta. Whether or not these incidents become national news, we must recognize for what they are. They are all based on hate and sadly are fueled at times by white supremacist violence. With that, I would like to now turn it over to Ursula Knight, who is the chief of our High Risk Victims Unit. Ursula will be discussing her unit's work and the collaboration they do with the Civil Rights Unit of the Boston Police Department, reviewing potential hate crimes and working with the communities that have unfortunately been the victims of this harm. Ursula, if you can start first, please, by telling us what specific categories are covered under hate crime statutes in Massachusetts. And thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you actually for inviting me into the community. It's nice to actually be in the community, albeit at a distance. I just wanted to introduce the unit, if I could take a moment and just say that the High Risk Victims Unit actually was initially the Elders and Persons with Disabilities Unit, because it covered crimes that occurred, harm that occurred against elders and people with disabilities. It was with the foresight of District Attorney Rollins that it became the High Risk Victims Unit, in order to incorporate into that unit the civil rights violations that were occurring, understanding that there was an intersection between the types of communities that were harmed. My unit is small but fierce, as I like to say. There's another district attorney, Patrick Lehman, who works tirelessly with me, and a victim witness advocate in Helen Davis, and an admin in McKenna Kavanaugh, and we wrap it up with our chief of investigations, Bill Loftus. collectively, we do what is, among other crimes, hate crimes, which is what we're here to discuss this evening. I do have a PowerPoint presentation, which I think will directly answer your question, that talks about the categories, and it will also show it. So if we could start with just where I began in looking forward to this evening, I was trying to do some research and sort of look around for some insight into what I see this evening as a way in which it will help us move forward. And I found this, and it said, as I quote, "As a result of several dramatic incidents of hate crimes and domestic terrorism, public awareness and concern over bias-motivated crimes have heightened, and the topic has steadily moved up the agendas of leaders of every level of government." And when I read that, I think if I were in front of you all and I could ask you when you think that this was written, certainly some might say it could have been written today or yesterday or a year ago. I found it somewhat surprising, although there are probably people out here listening who won't, that this was actually written in 1999. And so we've come a long way in terms of time, but maybe not in terms of progress. And so that is why I think events like tonight that District Attorney Rollins has brought forward to get into the community and to have these conversations is so incredibly vital. Having said that, I will turn now to sort of the nuts and bolts, and I will answer directly the DA's question about what categories. And as you can see, hate crimes are they are interchangeably known as bias-motivated crimes. They are offenses, as it says here, motivated by hatred against a victim based on, and as it says in the categories, race, religion, sexual orientation, disability, ethnicity, and national origin. I will make note of the fact that disability is a category in Massachusetts and some other states, but it is not nationwide, interestingly enough. And I will also suggest that you focus on those words, motivated by hatred, because that is essentially what sets hate crimes apart, is that in determining if something is a hate crime, we must actually determine what motivated the individual, the aggressor, the attacker in their conduct. And we must prove that it was motivated by hatred and against one of those protected classes. So unlike many other crimes, you actually have to look into the head and the heart, if you will, of the individual who's the actor in order to determine if something is indeed a hate crime. Next slide, Rick, thank you. How do we do that? So we have to look at certain factors to determine whether something is a hate crime. Sometimes it is very obvious on its face. The language that is used clearly indicates that there's a bias motivation. The things that we do look at are listed here. Is the motive known to be bias? And again, oftentimes that is just in the language. Does the victim perceive bias? Is that individual being singled out because they are in a protected class? Are there any other reasons for the incident? So if there's some other explanation, it may lead us away from charging a hate crime. However, oftentimes there are other reasons. It does not have to be the sole motivating factor. It just has to be part of the motivation of hatred. Is the incident, what is the timing of the incident? Is it near a holiday, or as we're seeing and as we're discussing tonight, is it during a pandemic when incidents of hate crimes against the AAPI community have clearly elevated? Demographic factors, of course, and then symbols associated with a hate group. And obviously what comes to mind is, for example, swastika. So as it says here, what sets hate crimes apart and raises them as more difficult to charge is that criminal acts motivated by bias can easily be confused with forms of expression protected by the First Amendment. So sometimes it is just speech alone, and albeit hateful speech and unacceptable, it does not rise to the level of criminal conduct. Next slide, Rick. Thank you. So factors that drive hate crimes. So we call this the climate of hate. What is going on that is driving hate crimes? Obviously, again, as we're speaking about tonight, the pandemic, hate-filled discourse, the media, politics, poor, uncertain economy. We have certainly seen all of this, particularly the media, the politics, the hate-filled discourse. And now with the social media being so prevalent, it makes it that much more prevalent in society. Now, in a climate of hate, a single incident can trigger a wave of hate crimes. So oftentimes it is one event occurs, and then obviously it catapults to others. Who is targeted? As I said earlier, it is the protected classes, and predominantly it is generally by race. And as will be discussed, I'm sure later, there has been an uptick in crimes against the AAPI community. And who targets? I think it's always interesting to know. Most often in these cases, it is individuals, singular actors. And then there are what we call mission offenders. Those are people who believe it is their mission to rid the world of a perceived evil. The next two slides, actually, Massachusetts General Law 265-37 and the following slide is Massachusetts General Law 265-39, are the two statutes that guide all of the charging of hate crimes, with the exception there's an additional statute, which I will discuss later, that goes to when a place of worship or synagogue or such is attacked, there's a separate charge for that. But for these are crimes against people. And these two statutes, both are violations of constitutional rights, and it tells you again specifically what has to occur. And generally, what both of them tell you is it has to be some sort of injury toward another, a use of force or threat of force, and a willfulness in the acting on part of the individual. Each of them can be charged as a misdemeanor, which means a case that involves, as punishment, a sentence to a jail. However, if there's injury in either of these two instances, or if there's a weapon used, that will enhance each of the crimes, and they will then be charged as felonies, which would then involve state prison sentences rather than House of Correction. In terms of, before we get to what can we do, no, it's fine to go ahead in the slides, but before we get to that, I think the way to illustrate sort of 265-37 and 265-39 is to just talk about a few of the cases that we have prosecuted. Just very generally, there recently have been some very difficult and challenging cases that we have prosecuted. One such case was that there was a Moroccan-American grandmother who was going to Ramadan services, and she was dressed traditionally and she had a headscarf on, and she got onto the train, and when she did, she was immediately accosted by an individual who was riding on the train who told her to get out of our country. And she said that this was her country, and he responded by saying, then take that off, and pointing to her headscarf. Of course, she did not do that. He then proceeded to further yell and scream about the train, saying that she had a bomb and that she was going to blow the train up. He then did some damage with inside the train. The train stopped at the next station, and she was able to make her way off. As she was getting off, he assaulted her and struck her with an umbrella, which was his weapon of choice, the only thing that he had, I believe, at the moment, and injured her by assaulting her in the back. That case was one that we prosecuted, and in that matter, the defendant was sentenced to jail as a consequence of his actions. A similar, or I should say another hate crime that we prosecuted more recently was there was a transgender female who was also wheelchair bound, who was attacked on the street by someone that she knew and had had a prior relationship with. And in the context of that, the individual who attacked her, he ended up stabbing her quite brutally, was calling her, and I quote, and forgive the language, faggot repeatedly, and continually stabbing her. He was prosecuted also for hate crime under those same statutes, and he received in that case a 5 to 7 year sentence for that brutal attack. There have been other situations. Again, on the train, we had an individual who was a Sikh, who was also wearing a head wrap. An individual on the train, again, told him to take the head wrap off. And when he, of course, did not do that, he then tried to attack him. There was some conversation in which he threatened to kill him because of the way in which he appeared, and told him that he wished that he would jump onto the third rail and die. Again, fortunately, the train stopped at a station and he was able to escape that harm. And again, that case was prosecuted to success with a jail sentence as well. Essentially, those are the types of crimes that fall into hate crimes categories and the ones that are prosecuted. As I mentioned earlier, there's also crimes which can be charged when there is damage done to a place of worship, or as some may be familiar with, when there was an incident in which there was damage done to the Holocaust memorial, and that was charged under that particular statute regarding injury or defacing a place of worship, and that is presently pending. In terms of wrapping it up here, what can we do? What I saw over and over is that reporting is the key to moving forward here and to enabling us to be more successful and find more progress in the reduction, if you will, of hate crimes. And as it says here, when law enforcement is trained to identify, respond to, and record hate crime incidents, more hate crimes are reported, responded to, and prosecuted. And I think you will hear later from the Boston Police Department directly that indeed, I think we're fortunate that we have not seen an uptick in AAPI charged crimes, and we have seen an uptick in reporting. So that is a bit of good news there. As far as what we can do, encourage reporting and create an effective reporting system, train law enforcement properly, collect data, very important. It is a data-driven endeavor here. Create a diversity awareness program for court. Interestingly enough, in one of the statutes, it requires, 26539 requires that on a successful prosecution, part of the penalty is that the defendant be mandated to a diversity awareness program. The downside is that there is not such a program in existence presently in the Commonwealth. And then finally create a hate crime or ethnic diversity curriculum to promote awareness of bias and prejudice in public high schools, middle schools, and elementary schools. Clearly, education is key. Finally, I leave you with this final thought, the last slide. This struck me. Certainly, I thought it was apropos to this evening, and so I leave you with this final quote. Tell me and I'll forget. Show me and I may remember. Involve me and I'll understand. And with that, I thank you all for your time and attention.
Excellent. So Ursula, I have a couple questions that I know the audience, I hope, is going to be asking, but we use words like civil rights violation and hate crime. Are those two words interchangeable? Do they mean the same thing?
You know, it's interesting, Rachel, they do and they don't, in that there are other violations, if you will, like a civil rights violation that may not be per se a hate crime. The hate crimes, those two statutes that I put up, that 265 and 37 and 265 39, those are specific hate crime statutes. And those are the ones that govern the conduct that is both physical and has some aspect to it that is motivated by hate.
Okay. And so give us, if you can, as you sit here, and sorry to put you on the spot, but what is an example of a civil rights violation that might not be a hate crime, just so we don't have to be you in order to understand what that nuance is?
I think we may have been talking about this. So you may violate somebody's civil rights because they may be, it may be a situation of discrimination. And you may discriminate against somebody and be violative of their civil rights, but you may not have committed a hate crime because it will not have been motivated by the bias or by the hatred. Right. So it's the distinction, I think, is in the intent, if you will.
Excellent. And then you talked about damage done to a place of worship. Obviously, we have sadly seen with Tree of Life, synagogue, and that those were murders, but the Holocaust memorial that we've seen. What about if somebody were to scrawl hatred on the side of somebody's home, right? Like a racial slur or anti-Semitic or anti-AAPI community home. I know that is not a physical harm to my body, but it has deeply, impacted where I bring my family and terrorized me in the place that I live. What type of things could we do in that circumstance? And I'm going to talk a little bit, Ursula, about the difference between civil and criminal matters in a moment, but go ahead.
So we actually charged such a situation in I believe it was Revere, where somebody scrawled on one's car, right? And somebody put hate-filled language on one's car, and we actually charged that because, by extension, we considered it an assault on the person. Now, in that case, there had been other conduct between the parties that indicated that it was motivated by bias. But that is a case that we would look carefully at. And I will say this, and I hope I'm saying it correctly. We are looking to charge these cases. So when we can find other evidence that connects them to being a hate crime, even if it is graffiti on somebody's car or some sort of language on somebody's car or on their business, if we can make that connection, that is a case we will charge as a hate crime.
Excellent. So this is helpful, Ursula. We're going to have you stick around, but we're going to move now to and accept the part I have, and of course I was waiting for you too, Ursula, but really the panel moving forward. So really quickly though, we are making sure, Ursula just said this, that the anti-Asian violence that we've seen across the country has targeted the most vulnerable people actually within that community. So not only the sort of, race-based crimes or ethnic-based crimes, but above and beyond that, elders in the community, right, who are protected. We've seen people with limited English proficiency, immigrants and low-wage workers. When we think about Atlanta, we've seen that 8 people lost their lives there, 7 women. 6 of those women were in the AAPI community. And although there have been sort of claims from the media about the fact of that they were massage workers or otherwise, there is this sort of white male sort of gaze or glaze regarding the situation and the shooter in particular. These women died and man died because of many people believe hatred of and discrimination against Asian women, and not because this individual had a bad day, as law enforcement had indicated. So what I want to do now is turn, if we can, to the panel. And I am going to have the pleasure of allowing Catherine Wong, Karen Chen, and James Chin to introduce themselves a little bit. I'm going to give each of you a minute to tell us a little bit about just a quick introduction, and then I'm going to get to your questions about what you currently do, what role you currently serve, and why you said yes to coming on this panel. So if you don't mind, Catherine Wong, can you tell us a little bit about your background and why you said yes to coming on this panel? Maybe a little longer than a minute, I know, but just a little bit about who you are, and I will interrupt when you don't say all the fabulous things I have written here. Catherine, please.
So good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be on this panel with you all. My name is Catherine Wong. I identify as she, her. I'm originally from the island of Hawaii, and I came to Boston for college over 3 decades ago. My first winter was the blizzard of 77, 78. Don't ask me why I'm still here. The youth, the young people, the community is what has made this my home now. But my heart will always be in Hawaii. Why I chose to be on this panel is that my work has centered on how do we create opportunities for AAPIs to be truly represented and feel like we have a sense of belonging. We're constantly being foreignized. We're constantly being told that we don't belong. And my work is really centered on working with young people on creating representation, bringing more AAPI educators into our urban schools so that young people can see themselves represented, that I come from a family background where education is not sort of a career of choice. In fact, my family said I talk too much and therefore they thought I should become an attorney. Longer story. But I chose education, and I chose it because I felt really called to be able to tell the stories of stories that often don't get told, that identify as Asian and Pacific Islander. I am both part Chinese and part Hawaiian. Your race becomes your face, so I'm often not asked about my Pacific Island heritage. And so I just think it's important that instead of invisibilizing who we are, that we continue to step up and say that actually we are a very vital part of the American experience.
Excellent, excellent. And I'm going to ask Karen Chen to go next. And then if we can, Joseph C., Sergeant Detective C., I see you as well. Apologies. I was scanning across my screen and had to slide over to see you. So we're going to make sure you're introduced as well in a moment. But Karen, do you mind telling us a little bit about what you do, Executive Director of the Chinese Progressive Association, all the great work you do there, and then why you said yes to this panel?
So, the Chinese Progressive Association, we're based in Chinatown. I mean, since the pandemic, we have helped so many families, in a lot of great need in their day-to-day. And that includes, fighting to stay in their homes, making sure that they go to work is safe and healthy. And then also, we're also seeing that, a lot of elderlies have been, cooped out at home. And a healthy thing, some family member thinks is like, well, you won't catch the virus or you won't get, harassed if you go out the door. But then, it's also unhealthy for them to stay home and, for so long and feeling like they can't really go out outside. And then, and I think that a lot of we're talking about crime and crime prevention and how to work with the community, a lot of times, poverty goes hand in hand with it. So I think that we feel like, I agree to this panel because I feel like there's some, outside of the box things that we can think about, how our community can, play a role in actually, fighting for, immediate solutions and also long-term. And then I think for me personally, I'm an immigrant from China. I came here when I was 10. I went to middle school in Charlestown. When I was in middle school, I get picked on a lot. The fact that I'm Chinese, I didn't speak English, and also I have very small stature. I'm like barely over 5'1". And then I think also, I also experienced an incident in Quincy in 2006, where me and my friends were charged with disorderly conduct and resisting arrest when we were in fact victims of police brutality. And that really, taught me kind of crime who's seen as criminals in the society, really shed light in my life and how we look at, who ended up in the criminal justice system, who doesn't, and how do we actually, address this issue, right? Because the goal is to eradicate hate crime and, any sort of bias-based crimes. And, and that will take everybody to work together.
Excellent. Deputy Superintendent Chen, can we have you tell us a little bit about what you do in the Boston Police Department, and then we will move over to Sergeant Detective C.
Hi, I'm Deputy Superintendent Jimmy Chen, and I work for the Boston Police Department. I'm currently assigned to the Bureau of Community Engagement. And basically, my job is to engage the community. So a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in the city of Boston. My parents immigrated here from China in the late 1950s and raised 4 children. I was the youngest of the 4. I grew up in a development in the South End near Chinatown and attended Boston Public Schools. I worked various jobs and attended college part-time before becoming a Boston police officer in 1993. I later continued my education, received my bachelor's degree in criminal justice and a master's degree in criminal justice administration. During my time of 28 years as a police officer, I've worked in various roles. I've worked in the anti-crime unit. I was a narcotics officer, a community service officer. I was a detective in the Crimes Against Children unit and domestic violence unit. I worked as a sergeant in the community service office, a sergeant detective in charge of general investigations. And approximately 2.5 years ago, I was asked and promoted to deputy superintendent, where I am still currently assigned to the Bureau of Community Engagement. I think this is very important, this panel. I want to thank DA Rollins for inviting me. The reason why I say yes is because I think I can bring to the table some personal experiences living in the city of Boston and experiencing, as a child, I've also experienced hate, you know, growing up in the city. In the 1970s, it was very segregated. You wouldn't leave your area because you were told not to leave your area because you might get into some trouble. And for a long time, I believed that. And, you know, as I grew older, now that I'm a police officer, I look back and I say, you know, I think part of it is we set up these barriers, right? And these barriers we need to break. Like as a child, it was, for me, I was psychologically believing that I couldn't cross a certain street and go into a certain neighborhood because, oh my God, they don't understand who I am. But I think that's the key here, is to try to educate everyone and the youth that there are no barriers. It's all in your head. Like I want to bring up an event that DA Rollins had a couple of years ago at Chez Vu, which is a roller skating rink, and that was in Mattapan. And I said, you know what? We're going to take 20 Asian youths from Chinatown, and we're going to bring them there.
And they had a blast. We had a blast.
And they mingled, and you know, like I looked at that and I said, this is what we need. We need to break these barriers. We need to bring these kids into the different neighborhoods and introduce them to different ethnic groups and things like that. So what I like about this panel is that I think we can bring some diversity and good ideas and maybe move ahead. We work with the DA's office. The Boston Police Department is very committed to, you know, fighting hate and everything else. So I won't take up any more time. That's just my introduction.
Yes, let me get Sergeant Detective, and then we're going to get into the questions. So Sergeant Detective C, will you tell us a little bit about what you do with the Boston Police Department, and then tell us why you said yes today?
Hi, good evening to all. First, I would like to thank District Attorney Rollins and her staff for the invitation for tonight's meeting. My name is Joey C. I'm a Sergeant Detective with the Boston Police Department assigned to the Civil Rights Unit. I'm just going to go briefly a brief history about myself. I came to the United States with my family at the age of 5. I grew up in Boston and was fortunate to obtain my education through the Boston public school system and gradually received my degrees from Northeastern University and Curry College. Growing up in Boston has not always been easy for me also. I have personally experienced racial incidents growing up, so I can certainly relate and empathize with all the victims of hate crimes. Since, as far as I can remember, I've always wanted to be a police officer, as helping people has always been my passion. I was able to fulfill my dreams and started my career as a Boston police officer 27 years ago. Throughout my career, I have worked in various parts of the city. I've worked in Dorchester, Roxbury, Hyde Park, downtown Boston, and I'm proud to say that Boston is a great city, great diverse city to live in. What I would like to see is the continued efforts of educating the public, as well as delivering the message of anti-hate to all. And the reason for me to join this panel today, as I stated that with personal experience, I can definitely relate and empathize with what's going on in today's climate. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. So one of the things I wanted to start with, and Catherine, if we can maybe start with you, is there is a huge, amazing, fabulous, like group of nations that when we say AAPI, there might be some ignorance in other communities about what that means when we say AAPI. Can you take us through quickly, just, or not quickly, let's stay right here for a minute. What does it mean when somebody is from the AAPI community? Go ahead, Catherine. I'm going to mute myself.
So thank you for that question. What I think is so important is that so often when we say, well, one is also just doing the terminology, right? So Asian Americans leaves out Pacific Islanders. AAPI makes an assumption that someone is both an Asian and a Pacific Islander, but that's not always the case. And so the preferred term is Asian American and Pacific Islander. And in some cases, like in mine, I do identify as both. But in terms of looking at the expansiveness, and one of the things that everyone has mentioned, including Ursula, is the need for continued education. Because I think that one of the causes of the hate is this danger of a single story that Ms. Adichie talks about when she talks about the danger of a single story, that the Asian American and Pacific Islander story has been framed in a single story. And so what the model minority myth does is it doesn't allow us to see that there are over 50 plus ethnicities across the continent of Asia, as well as over 100 plus languages. And so when we look at that diversity, we move ourselves away from the homogenization, we again be able to expand that history and think about how is it that we want to represent, and how is it that we want to be able to distinguish the histories versus feel that, again, that we have to keep foreignizing them and create this sense that we don't belong. We know there's a long history of the Exclusion Act, of the Japanese internment. So again, there's history that actually sets us as foreigners. My charge to us is how do we, through education, create curriculum so that, again, we're looking at the expansiveness of the slide that you see in front of you right now, when I just sort of went to grab to say, okay, let me figure out a way that I can show that, in fact, that there are, 50 plus sort of different ethnicities here.
That's fascinating. And, I know that we are everywhere, right? And I have made my ampersand very big here. So AA and PI community. What are some of the larger groups in the AA and PI community that are represented? Whether maybe we can have Karen, if you want to answer this, or any of the deputy superintendent or sergeant detectives that are really vibrant communities and active larger communities in Boston, and even smaller ones that some of us might not know about. So Karen, do you want to take that?
Sure, thank you. So I think that probably, people know, one of the kind of largest group of actually Asians are East Asian, right? Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and then you also have Southeast Asian. So I say that, I think that probably often, a lot of times when people say Asian, they mostly associate with Chinese, actually. And this is why when a former president, say things like Chinese virus, even though he said Chinese, because of clumping all of us together, people associate anyone who looks like Chinese, right? Or that you think that they look like Chinese, it's impacted by it. So, and I think I would say that also, I think that in this context also too, like Southeast Asians are the largest refugee groups. They're from Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, and a lot of the Southeast Asian countries. So I would say that, but each one of the experiences that we have in terms of how we got here to the US is very different. And also another thing that people don't know is that I think Asian Americans are not quite out there talking about this issues. Asian Americans actually have the largest number of undocumented people. And it has to do with, people immigrate or migrate, push and pull factors. And, how we get here and the issues that associate with each community is very different. And I think in terms of income as well, you have some very well-to-do Asians, and you also, or AAPIs, and you have also very poor. And then it's kind of very, very little in the middle. It would be kind of like a U. So you have lots of wealthy. And then, so that's also, when you mix it with this model minority myth that we had, it was not, model minority myth. It's like, oh, you're the better minority. It's not necessarily work out better for us a lot of times. It's actually created more invisibility. And, and I think that it also, when you lump all of them together, it's harder to target, what each community face. And that's why we feel like, collecting data, that's why data disaggregation is so important. And that's why, we say that, because when you say nobody speaks Asian, right? Like, you speak Chinese, even if Chinese is Mandarin, Cantonese, or other languages, right? And there's Japanese, Korean, and, all these different languages. So So that's why it's important for us to disaggregate data so that we know what each community needs. And I think that it's also, health professionals would say that each group also have different needs, and same thing with education and so on and so forth. And so if we really want to have really good programs, we need to make that distinction.
Absolutely. Catherine, so tagging back with what Catherine said about this sort of one story, right? There's the story about everyone believes that the immigrant story or the people that are being deported are only in the Latinx community, right? Which is absolutely not true. And then the model minority is AA and PI community. And you're right, we are far more than just one story. We each have likely dozens of stories, if not more than that, each of us. So we have to do the hard work there. And I love, Karen, you pointing out the huge wealth-based disparities. There have been studies showing that in the AA and PI community, it's larger than any other ethnic or minority group within the AA and PI community. And then additionally, I have seen as district attorney, many members from the Vietnamese community, many members from the Cambodian community, terrified with respect to ICE, right? Terrified with respect to deportation. And we have to really educate all of us, but certainly within communities of color, the BIPOC community ourselves, that there is not one narrative, because we discriminate as well, right? We make assumptions. This is not just a white person issue. We all have to work on educating. So Deputy Superintendent and Sergeant Detective, can you guys talk maybe about some of the communities in Boston that are, really, strong communities, or there are larger populations possibly? I know we are everywhere, right? Like, so my father's from Ireland and my mom's family's from Barbados, and people think of West Indians as only Jamaicans, but there's like maybe only 40 people from Barbados here, but we exist, right? Talk to me a little bit about different neighborhoods in Boston that have really strong communities throughout the AA and PI community.
Well, I think Chinatown obviously has a huge Chinese population, and actually it's mixed. It's everybody thinks it's all Chinese, but there's Vietnamese, there's Korean, there's all different types, right? But our biggest areas would be Chinatown and Dorchester and parts of Brighton, where the Asian community is huge. So in Chinatown, it'll be Chinese, in Dorchester, it would be Vietnamese, and in Brighton, it'll be a good mix. So I think I agree with Karen and Catherine. There's so many Asians, right? Like, that's such a loosely used title, right? So, and everybody has a different story of how they came to this country, and generational. And like, if you look at the West Coast now, they're like in their 10th, 11th generation of Asians that immigrated here earlier. That goes back, and there's a lot of history there, the building of the railroads and things like that. So, I think basically in Boston, though, that's those targeted areas is where we concentrate on, educating the community as to breaking those barriers, especially trust with the police officers, because a lot of Asian immigrants who come here, they come from countries where they don't necessarily trust their law enforcement. They come from like militarized like communities and things like that. So traditionally, especially in the police department, we don't see Asians reporting crimes in general, because they just don't want to come to a police officer for help. They think that something's going to happen to them. So again, that's where we are with the different communities, and we try to educate them through the community meetings, events, things like that, through the newspaper, like the Sampan newspaper and things like that. So we've been printing things, and we're trying to translate into different languages, simplified Chinese, Vietnamese, and get like these brochures of the Civil Rights Unit out to the community, so they know how to report a crime and things like that. And
you have language capacity in the Boston Police Department, and I know that Sergeant Detective, I think, has popped off and he's going to pop back on and I'll ask this question, but I always get nervous. Ursula said earlier, you know, the number of hate crimes aren't increasing in the AA and PI community. However, right, like, is that we can't believe, I believe data often, but in this circumstance, it might be because people are afraid to come forward, or there's some barrier. And this is not about the Boston Police Department. This is more about how are we making it easier for people to report things? How are we coming into community to do that? So before we do that, you know, I wanted to see, Catherine, do you have anything you want to add to that? I saw you shaking your head. Is there anything you want to add to what I said?
Yes, thanks. Because I was agreeing with you that I think that it may not be reported as a hate crime, but it doesn't mean that incidents themselves or racism is not happening. And so, you know, stopasianhate.org actually did a whole report on particularly what's happening with young people and what's happening with elders. And one of the things they found is that elders are much more afraid of other Americans than they are of the coronavirus. And that actually brought me to tears, because it's one thing to know it, it's another thing to see the data. And as Karen said, the issue of needing to disaggregate all the time, not just some of the time, so that we can actually see what's really happening. The other thing is I wanted to go back to what you had mentioned about the model minority myth, that we need to understand that it was started during the civil rights era, and it was done on purpose. It was started by a white magazine editor that basically called out and said that, right, exactly, Japanese and Chinese were the models. But the model minority myth in and of itself is set up to generate hatred between AAPIs and other people of color, so that there becomes a threat factor. And I always come back when I'm teaching about this, is that the threat factor services a dominant culture. It doesn't service the BIPOC community. What it does is it tears us away from each other. And so what we need to do in terms of the education is really looking at that, instead of just saying model minority, that in fact it is about institutional racism, and that there was a particular reason why it was raised, created, and it continues to be perseverated.
Yeah. And so when I read in the Globe, you know, Shirley Luong wrote a really interesting story recently about the fact that when asked, people in Boston, right, in readers of the Globe, asked to list famous or even, you know, not famous AA and PI people that they knew, there was some like just embarrassing percentage that couldn't even name anyone, or named Bruce Lee or a person who was dead, and another action, you know, like movie action hero, right? So can we talk about just the sort of the kind of invisibility, right? And the fact that we need to be educating ourselves so much more. We even see, with respect to a mayoral candidate in New York, there was just recently a caricature that was done where his wife, and I love her, said, like, how dare you? I was born here. He's lived here for 25 years. Our two sons are being raised and going to, you know, schools in New York, public schools there, and don't call us tourists, right? It's this sort of narrative of you don't belong here happening more. So Deputy Superintendent or possibly Karen, can you say something? And then Sergeant Detective, I'll get to you in 1 second. Anything you have to say with respect to that, or even Catherine?
So I think that, you know, this sense of not belonging, right? You know, it's very much, you know, the conditions that people are in. But if you say that, you know, but if we think about, you know, what are the contributions of Asian Americans or APIs in this country is huge. It is also have not talked about at all, and we get written out of, you know, history. And that's why right now, you know, young people actually young people have been fighting for Asian American studies, ethnic studies for, you know, decades and decades, and finally now it's getting more traction, you know, because for a lot of it also too, you know, like there's a lot of Asian American activists was part of the civil rights movement. A lot of them actually were inspired by the civil rights movement. The Chinese Progressive Association, many of the founders, they were inspired by the civil rights movement. They went to college, they were part of the anti-war movement. They came back and they feel like, we have the privilege to go to college and we have the responsibility to give back to the community. And a lot of these stuff were not talked about much at all. And I would say that, also there are many, many, many heroes in our community that doesn't get written about. The elderly that are helping their neighbors with grocery. The people who are making sure that their neighbors have they need. During the pandemic, even before that. The person who encourage a neighbor to say, hey, you know what, you're getting evicted, but don't just take it. Maybe you can fight to stay. The person that tells the coworkers and say, you actually have a right to minimum wage and overtime. That's also a heroic act that doesn't get talked about a lot. And I think that we would just kind of have the stereotype that, submissive in your, just keep your heads down. But actually, there's a lot of, amazing work have done in the community. I wish it gets talked about more often.
Excellent, right? And I mean, even thinking about, I'm a lawyer, so I think about the exceptional lawyers that I saw, right? Paul Lee at Goodwin Proctor, right? Justice Duffley on the Supreme Judicial Court of our Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and we need more AA and PI justices all over the bench. I am fortunate to have Amanda Teo in my office as a chief of staff. Mark Lee, who's one of the best lawyers we have, not only in Suffolk, but I would argue certainly the Commonwealth, is the deputy of our homicide unit, exceptional lawyer. So Sergeant Detective, when I know you're having a couple of little issues getting on, and we apologize if that is our fault. But while you were gone, we were just talking about the fact that even although Ursula said that the hate crime reports are down, we don't necessarily believe that because we want to make sure there's access to reporting. And we heard a little bit while you were gone about certain communities, not just AA and PI communities, but others that are fearful of going to law enforcement for whatever potential reason. Can you talk to us a little bit about what we've seen regarding, your unit and what different types of things come into your unit from civilian complaints, number one. And then I will quickly explain the distinction. What is great about our Attorney General, Maura Healey, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Attorney General Healey is ambidextrous. She has a civil division and a criminal division. So she can charge you in a grand jury with something or charge you with a crime, or she can look into you for a civil rights violation, right? With the Mass Commission Against Discrimination, and the U.S. Attorney's Office is ambidextrous too. They have a civil division and a criminal division. I have one very strong dominant hand where we can bring criminal charges against people, but we don't operate in the civil world. So Sergeant Detective, can you just tell us what generally is the community, the AA and PI community, dealing with right now, and what type of complaints, if you have received any, are you getting from the community now?
So, can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Mm-hmm.
First, let me apologize because I am having some technical difficulty. Can everyone hear me? Okay. So, a couple of things. There were some great points provided earlier as far as reporting. Reporting is key, as it was indicated earlier that the Asian community does have historically have a fear of reporting crimes, but through the educating and the public service announcements, the PSAs, I think we're starting to see a lot more Asian communities starting to report, and that's also through the great work of community outreach programs. Just looking at some of the numbers in the last couple of years pre-COVID, the numbers of Asian victims has increased as far as the reporting. And I could say that I believe that those are contributed to in a couple of parts, is COVID pandemic, as also the reporting through the education through community outreach programs. What we're seeing is that as the numbers are increasing of the reports coming in, and these are incidents that's for hate bias motivators, that's what we look for. And each incident that comes in is being reviewed and investigated by our detectives. So as those numbers, we do see 2021 year to date, number has gone up. And I believe that those are contributed to the amount of reports coming in due to the education.
Okay, and then what I want to make sure, because I know we're getting a little bit short on time, but what I would love to hear is maybe give each of you guys maybe a minute to a minute and a half. If we were going to talk about, and you don't have to only stay in your lane. So although Catherine is an expert with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion, K through 12 all the way to higher education. You don't have to only stay in education. But what are some of the things, for example, that we can be doing better, not just in law enforcement, but as elected officials or community leaders with respect to not only educating, but something that you would like to see moving forward, as we come out of COVID-19, that we can do better, particularly whether directed at us on this call or just generally to all the people that are listening. Why don't we start with Catherine and then we'll move through.
I was going to ask to start with someone else so I could have a minute to think.
Oh, yep.
Somebody else ready?
Deputy superintendent. That's why he's paid the big bucks. We'll start with the deputy superintendent, and then we'll come back to you in a little bit. So go ahead, deputy superintendent.
Yeah, put the pressure on me.
That's right.
Well, I think there are a lot of things that, like, obviously for the elected officials, right, who are listening, they can use that platform to further educate the public, of what's going on and how to report crimes. And, I think this is all a partnership, and everybody has a responsibility to spread the information that we have out there. And it shouldn't just rely on just the AAPI community. Like, I'm talking all ethnic groups, right? Like, any hate is universal, right? It's not just the AAPI community. It's not, it's not just a converting community. It's every community. So I think, we need to do a better job of getting that word out that we have a civil rights unit, that the district attorney's office will prosecute, and, that we take this very seriously, and from the police department's perspective, I think we're trying to do a better job by placing the right officers in the communities that speak the language, right? So the more bilingual officers that we can get on the force, the easier it makes people to report. It gives them a sense of, familiarity with the police officer, and they can identify with them. That's what I found in my career, that most of the time they may come to a Chinese officer to report it. If he's a Chinese person, he might come to me to report, and maybe not to another ethnic officer. So, those are a lot of the things that we're working on. But, I don't want to take all the time. I could talk forever.
All right. So, Karen, do we want to go, if we can, to you about what would you like the people that are watching right now? We're going to be posting this as well, so people can watch it later if they didn't attend right now. What do you want to say to us or to the people that are going to watch it here now, or electeds, about what we can do differently?
So I think that, what Deputy Chin said earlier is that, sorry, I messed up on your title because it's like too long. Said earlier, I think in terms of cross-community dialogue, it's very important. I work for the Chinese Progressive Association because I believe in people and community. We often can find, solutions in the community and use that to alter, how we actually do things. If we do things business as usual, it's going to be difficult to address issues, right, holistically. So I think that, I would encourage for us to think about alternative approaches, like using, restorative justice approaches, right, to crime or to hate, to conflicts. And it's just a model, but I think it's like, well, where will it get us? We're kind of not sure, but all we know is that, locking people up, is not going to prevent crime, and we all are in agreement on that. So let's find something else. And I think that in terms of, besides finding solution in the community, having a holistic view, right? Like for, like housing stability, good jobs, healthy environments, good schools, we all know that will help, stabilize community, and that will prevent, crime, so we don't just stop at, police patrolling. Because if someone, let's say, have an addiction, right? There are someone stepping stools, doing drugs. If you have patrolling, you would just move that person from one person's stepping stool to the next, and it becomes someone else's problem, but it doesn't solve the problem, because they probably needs to a program for addiction. If someone is homeless, bothering somebody, maybe you need to provide them with a home, and a job, to keep them busy, So I think that, so for us to really think about, these ways of, looking just beyond kind of like, okay, this is my lane or this is mine, but really, seeing people as a whole person, and then also seeing society as whole, and then using that as a way to really, change. We know when something is not working, and then try to change it, and maybe change some protocols, change some of the ways, and invite someone different, into the group, into the discussion.
I love it. And so Karen is amazing. I want to tell one story, probably the story I love the most about when I was campaigning. I remember being in Chinatown and walking through, there was some amazing event where every single person that was running for anything was there. And I walked by these two beautiful women that must have been like 70s, 80s years old, very short. And they were walking, and one of them pointed at me. Neither of them spoke English. I, looked, and they pulled something out of their pocket, and there was a picture of me, all in either Cantonese or Mandarin. And they pointed at this, and they went like this, and I was like, "Oh my God, they're gonna vote for me!" And it was just like they knew exactly who I'm like welling up with tears. It was unreal, like how amazing the community coming together. That I was like, this is like amazing work that people come together and explain the process, and even through translation, it was awesome. So I remember every time when they both pointed at me, it was unreal. All right, so let me do this. I'm going to have Sergeant Detective, you talk a little bit about, if you don't mind, what you would like us to learn from this process, and then we can move forward. To Catherine, so get ready because I'm coming to you.
Okay,
next.
great.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I can't emphasize enough how important I feel that delivering the message is that's what we need. And I would start that with the youth. They are our future. I believe that if we could start them young, educate them while they're in school, explain to them the difference, the right and the wrong, the importance of anti-hate, and that is where it begins. These kids are our future, and that's where it begins. They're the root of our future.
So we have one question, Sergeant Detective, that we just got a question that said, how do you handle situations, and I don't know what the age of this person is, but let's see if we can, when you have an individual who is continuously bullied, harassed, for whatever reason, and the police have not helped due possibly to not enough complaints, or that there have been several complaints and they haven't helped. What would you say to somebody? I don't know if this is a young person that this is happening in school and there might be a school resource officer, but what would you say to somebody who is being bullied, either in their personal life, or possibly if it was a younger person in school? How would you react to that? Possibly Detective Superintendent or Sergeant Detective?
Go ahead, Joey.
So let me just begin a little bit. So I think that's kind of a two-part question. I'm not too sure, like you alluded to, I don't know what's the age of the person asking the question. As far as bullying, I know we do have school resources available. And if the person is an adult and this person is constantly being harassed by whether it's a neighbor, a friend, or colleague at work, there's actions that could be taken. We do have a harassment prevention order, which is the 250 EHPO. Any forms of harassment that's documented over 2 incidents there are criminals complaints that we could solve, that we'll see after, and that's the harassment prevention order. It works very similar to a restraining order, and the difference is that in a harassment order, there's no relationship. So that's why I explained that it's more so for neighbors, friends, colleagues, employees. And so, documenting is very important. Everything needs to be documented. It's going to show the pattern over 2 incidents, and that's where we go forward.
Yeah, and so although that is sometimes hard for non-members of law enforcement to hear, that like, wait, so I have to endure this more than once, or at least twice before I can do something. But you're right, Sergeant Detective, if we document, if you at least go in, and then certainly we've had some incidents where I've worked with the Winthrop Police Department, for example, about an incident that happened there. Hearing others talk about restorative justice, there are ways that even if the individual that's perpetrating the harm, if the rest of the community comes out and is notified or now aware of this, others can take advantage of the fact that they are aware of it. And when they see it happening, stop it from happening. But Danielle, if you want to reach back out to the person that asked that question, they can reach out to us after we're done, because we are going to close out with the fabulous Catherine. And I can answer the question back to them or get them in touch with somebody if they have additional questions. Catherine, what will you take us home with, what you would like us to learn from this time or do differently or better? And then I will just quickly say a few words and we'll be done. Thank you,
Okay.
Catherine.
Thank you, DA Rollins. I think my closing comments would focus on shifting the script with our young people. They are our teachers. They are stepping up. They are making a voice. And I think we also need to understand that they are also operating in a land of contradiction. Because on one end, we're saying, show up, rise up, share your voice. And generationally, they may be being told, keep your head down, don't make waves. And so I believe that, again, how do we create a circle of support around them so that the both and the paradoxes can actually live together versus being seen as either or? And so I think that, and part of that for me has always been, how do we shift so that it's not always a top-down way that we're thinking about education, but so I know I always come back to education, but how are we thinking and working with our young people so that they are co-constructing their education with us? There's nothing saying that they can't become co-writers or co-creators on a curriculum. I've done it with young people, and it is amazing the work that they come up with. They're very open to critiquing, given the permission to do so. And so I think so again, my thing would be, let's remove the shroud of silence of the model minority myth. Let's be open to eradicating it by raising up our young people and allowing them to teach us.
Excellent. Well, what I will say is, I was proud to stand in front of the State House after the ignorance of the then President of the United States making hate-filled statements about an entire community that were wrong, right? Not only false, but wrong. And I think we need to show up more for each other. So even when I hear Deputy Superintendent talking about the Rollins rollout and roller skating, we need to invite each other to things, right? And we need to make sure that not just in the moments of trauma, but in the moments of joy, of which there are so many that we have, and we need to recognize that as well. But certainly when our community is hurting and we see, sadly, this awful uptick of hate, just blatant hate against the AA and PI community, and even more troubling, elders in that community, right, that are being terrorized. And I was recently at a forum inside of the Suffolk County House of Corrections, and just, Michelle Wu, one of the candidates there, speaking about just how fearful she is for her mother, right? And there's just a piece of this where we all deserve joy. We all deserve to be able to live our lives to the best of our abilities and to pursue life, liberty, and happiness like everyone else. So I want to thank you guys for opening up our eyes about different things. This will not be the last time that I call upon you, and I certainly hope you call upon me to help in any way possible. I appreciate the work you're doing. Thank you. And thank you, Ursula, Catherine, Karen, Deputy Superintendent, Sergeant Detective, and my fabulous community engagement team. Thank you guys. Enjoy the rest of the night. Be well.
Thank you.